The ocean stretched endlessly, a deep, serene blue under the late afternoon sun, as the luxury cruise ship glided smoothly over gentle waves. Madison Taylor moved between tables on the open deck, balancing trays with practiced ease. She had become adept at catering to the whims of the wealthy passengers, always offering a polite smile no matter the demand. Her life had become routine, predictable, and she preferred it that way. It kept her grounded, allowing her to put the pain of her past behind her. But as she neared the corner of the deck where a lively gathering of passengers sat, she felt a strange pull, a sensation she couldn't explain. At first she thought it was just the heat playing tricks, but as she drew closer the feeling grew stronger, almost as if a hand had reached out and tugged her heart back in time. She slowed, her grip on the tray tightening. Among the small group, laughing and leaning against the railing, was a man with striking features that felt disturbingly familiar. His back was partially turned, but the tilt of his head, the shape of his jaw, the way he held himself, it all stirred something deep within her. Madison shook her head, trying to dispel the absurd notion forming in her mind. Her husband, Blake Taylor, had died 7 years ago, or so she had believed. She'd grieved, moved on, found solace in this very job, in the simplicity and predictability it offered. But this man, this stranger, wore Blake's face like an unwanted ghost. Madison took a shaky breath and quickly looked away, heart pounding. She forced herself to keep moving, to continue serving other guests, but she couldn't shake the nagging pull of curiosity and disbelief. She circled back, catching glimpses of him as he laughed, his voice carrying over the breeze. The way he tossed his head, the sound of his laughter, even the lines in his face were heartbreakingly familiar. "It can't be," she whispered to herself, panic beginning to well up in her chest. Her mind scrambled for explanations. Was she hallucinating? Had her grief finally caught up with her, twisting her memories into something real? And yet, the reality of his presence pressed against her senses, undeniable and overwhelming. She stole another glance, this time lingering, as if the answer would reveal itself if she looked long enough. He was dressed sharply, exuding a confidence that hinted at success and luxury, so far from the struggling husband she'd known. But the lines of his face, his unmistakable smile, and the way his eyes crinkled at the edges, it was him. She was certain of it. Her vision swam as 1,000 questions collided in her mind. How could he be here? Why hadn't he reached out if he was alive? And how had he transformed from the man she had loved and mourned into someone who radiated wealth and privilege? The cruise deck faded around her, the laughter and chatter of passengers blending into a distant hum. Madison's world had just tilted on its axis, and in that moment she knew nothing would ever be the same. Madison couldn't concentrate, her mind spinning back to the past like a film reel she couldn't pause. 7 years ago she had been happily married to Blake Taylor, a man who was everything to her. Her friend, her confidant, her partner in every sense. She had loved him fiercely, and together they had shared dreams of building a life, one brick at a time, with simple plans and an enduring promise of loyalty. But life had rewritten those dreams in an instant. One icy winter evening, the police had arrived at her door. They delivered the news with a measured, rehearsed sympathy. Blake had gone missing while out on a solo trip, his car found abandoned near a steep ravine. Rescue teams had searched for days, but when days turned into weeks, they eventually concluded that no one could survive that fall. His body was never recovered, leaving her with only fragments of memories and a hollow grief that felt both endless and unresolved. In the months that followed, Madison had felt like she was drowning, her life slipping from her grasp one day at a time. There were debts. Blake had left behind more than she realized, and she was left scrambling to hold on to even the smallest bits of stability. Bills piled up, family and friends drifted away, and she found herself isolated, trapped in a cage of loss and helplessness. Madison had finally taken a job on the cruise line 2 years after Blake's death, finding a strange comfort in the regimented days, the open sea, and the distance from her old life. It was a place to escape the reminders of her past, to drift without questions or complications. Here, among strangers, she could pretend that she was someone else, someone whose life hadn't been shattered by a love cut tragically short. Yet now, every sense of control she'd worked so hard to reclaim had been torn away in an instant. If that man on the deck truly was Blake, then what was the last 7 years? What had her suffering been for? She couldn't escape the burning question that clawed at her. Why? Why would he let her believe he was dead, leave her to grieve alone? As she clung to the rail, the steady pulse of the ocean below seemed to echo her own turmoil. The life she thought she knew, the grief she thought she had left behind, had returned, demanding answers. Madison couldn't stay away. Throughout her shift, her eyes kept drifting toward Blake, who was surrounded by his new circle of wealthy friends, laughing as though he hadn't a care in the world. Every time she glanced his way, memories from their past life flashed in her mind, overlapping with the stranger she now saw before her. It was a painful juxtaposition that only intensified her shock and confusion. As the evening unfolded, Madison managed to keep her distance, but her body felt like it was moving on autopilot. Drinks poured, plates cleared, trays balanced, all while her mind remained riveted on the impossible reality a few steps away. Every nerve in her body urged her to march over to him to demand answers, but fear held her back. She worried about making a scene, about the whirlwind of emotions she might unleash if she confronted him too soon. Finally, as the crowd began to thin, she saw her chance. Blake had moved away from the larger group and stood by the railing, gazing out at the water with a thoughtful expression she remembered well. It was the same way he used to look out at the horizon back when they would talk about their future, back when she believed they'd build a life together. Madison inhaled deeply, steadying herself as she approached. Each step felt like crossing into a memory, one that both terrified and pulled her forward with a force she couldn't resist. She reached the spot beside him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he would hear it. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Blake turned, his eyes meeting hers, and in that instant, Madison saw something flicker across his face, something she recognized as shock. His confident facade faltered for a split second, and she knew he had recognized her, even if he didn't immediately acknowledge it. "Yes," he replied, his voice smooth but guarded, like he was bracing himself. For a moment, Madison's words stuck in her throat. But then all the years of loneliness and pain broke through her hesitation. She whispered, "Blake, it's me. Madison." He blinked, his expression transforming from shock to something colder, almost unreadable. The warmth she remembered in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calculating gaze, like a stranger sizing her up. After a painfully long pause, he forced a smile. "I think you must be mistaken," he said smoothly with a slight shake of his head. "I don't know anyone by that name." Madison's stomach churned, anger simmering just beneath the surface. She knew that look. It was the same one he'd given people in the past when he was hiding something. She took a small step closer, her voice firm. "Don't lie to me, Blake. I know it's you. I'd know you anywhere." For a fleeting moment, something softened in his gaze as though he was about to drop the act. But then he straightened, his face hardening again. "I'm sorry. You must have me confused with someone else." The words hit her like a slap. Madison felt a wave of emotions, rage, betrayal, sadness, all vying for control. Here was the man she had once loved, who had vanished without a trace, looking at her as if she were a stranger. But she knew it was him. The details were too precise. The shape of his nose, the dimple that appeared when he smirked, even the way he held himself. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice quivering. "Why are you pretending? Why would you let me think you were dead all these years?" Blake didn't respond, only tightened his grip on the railing and glanced around as if wary of any prying eyes. He took a step back from her, his gaze cold and detached. "I'm sorry, miss, but you're mistaken. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Madison rooted to the spot, feeling as though the ground had been yanked out from under her. She watched his retreating figure, her mind spinning with disbelief and an overpowering sense of betrayal. Madison stood frozen, her mind racing as she watched Blake walk away, his figure fading into the mingling crowd of passengers. The cold dismissal she'd just experienced was like a slap in the face, leaving her reeling with a confusing cocktail of emotions. She knew him, there was no question in her mind. But his insistence, his complete denial of her, planted the smallest seed of doubt. Could it really be him, or was she somehow mistaken? She needed answers. Steeling herself, Madison returned to the staff quarters and found her friend Elena, a fellow server who had a knack for gathering information. "I need your help," Madison whispered, pulling her aside. The urgency in her voice must have been obvious, because Elena immediately agreed. Madison kept her request simple, asking Elena to pull up the guest list, especially anyone traveling under VIP status. Within minutes, Elena returned with a discreet nod. "I found him," she said, handing Madison a paper with a single name highlighted. Daniel Blackwood, listed as a businessman from New York. The name was unfamiliar, but the background check listed his recent wealth accumulation, investments in luxury goods and real estate. If it wasn't Blake, the resemblance and his lifestyle change were chillingly coincidental. But it wasn't just his name that had changed. The man on the deck was polished and wealthy, wearing clothes that were a far cry from the humble attire Blake used to wear. Memories of late nights counting change for groceries, his constant worry about bills, contrasted starkly with the man who now seemed effortlessly wealthy. Despite the name on the list, Madison was more convinced than ever. The resemblance was too precise, his reactions too familiar. The way he'd looked at her, even briefly, was undeniably Blake. But why would he fake his own death and take on a new identity? And why live so openly now? Her pulse quickened as she decided on her next step. She would confront him again, but this time she'd press him until he admitted the truth. The pain of being abandoned, of grieving a man who had been alive all along, seethed within her. She had been owed an explanation for 7 years, and she wouldn't rest until she got one. Later that evening, Madison waited until the crowd on the deck had dispersed, leaving a quiet lull over the ship. She had spotted Blake, or rather Daniel, leaning against the bar, away from the watchful eyes of his wealthy companions. It was a rare, quiet moment, and she intended to use it. She had rehearsed her words over and over, but as she approached him, her pulse raced, and her mind spun with everything she needed to say. She couldn't let him walk away from her again, not without answers. She took a steadying breath and stepped into his line of sight. "We need to talk," she said, her voice as firm as she could make it. He looked up, visibly irritated. For a moment he simply studied her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he didn't respond. "Blake," she said, her tone sharper this time. "I know who you are. You can pretend all you want, but I need to know why. Why did you let me believe you were dead?" Blake's face tensed, the confident, smooth facade faltering under her directness. He glanced around to make sure they were alone, and his eyes narrowed. "Look," he said finally, his voice low, clipped, "I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Daniel." "Daniel?" she repeated, her voice heavy with disbelief. "So, that's the life you're hiding behind now? A new name, a new story, all after you left me to think you were gone?" Her voice cracked with the bitterness she had bottled up for years. She had rehearsed what she might say if she ever found him again, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw hurt that surfaced now. He closed his eyes briefly as if wrestling with some inner conflict, then exhaled, leaning back against the bar. "Fine," he said, his voice quieter now. "You're right. I am Blake. But I'm not the man you remember." Madison's hands clenched, nails digging into her palms. "You're not the man I remember? Blake, you vanished from my life. I spent years grieving for you, thinking you were gone. I lost everything we had, our home, our plans, our future, because of you. What? Why would you do that to me?" He met her gaze, his face a mask of mixed emotions. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice hollow. "The life we had, it was falling apart. The debts, the mistakes I made, I felt trapped. Leaving was the only way I could escape. I needed to be free." "Free?" Her voice broke, a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You left me to pick up the pieces, Blake. I was the one who suffered. I didn't deserve that." She struggled to keep her voice steady, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. He looked away, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I thought I was doing you a favor," he murmured. "I thought you'd be better off without me." "A favor?" Madison's disbelief turned to rage. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? I had to rebuild everything from nothing. Do you know how many nights I spent wondering if it was my fault, if I could have done something to save you?" His face softened slightly, but he remained silent, as if unable, or unwilling, to face the depth of her pain. After a long pause, he finally muttered, "I didn't know. I didn't realize it would be that hard on you. I thought you'd move on, that you'd be better off in the long run." Madison's chest ached with a mixture of fury and sorrow. "Better off," she whispered. "You thought abandoning me would make my life easier? You were my husband, Blake. I loved you, and you left me with nothing but questions and a shattered life." He looked down, unable to meet her gaze, and in that moment, Madison saw the man he had become, cold, detached, unwilling to acknowledge the devastation he had caused. The Blake she had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who wore his face but seemed to lack any of his warmth or remorse. She took a step back, her voice hardening. "I don't know who you are anymore, but I won't let you pretend this never happened. I deserve answers. I deserve to know why you destroyed our life, left me in ruins, and then came back as if none of it mattered." He seemed to search for words, his expression torn, but before he could respond, a group of passengers drifted into the bar area, laughing and chatting. Blake glanced at them, his mask of indifference slipping back into place. He straightened, his voice cold once more. This isn't the time or place for this. I have nothing more to say. Madison felt a hollowness settle in her chest as she watched him walk away yet again. But this time she was no longer the grieving widow left behind. She was ready to fight for the answers she deserved. Madison returned to her cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. As soon as the door closed behind her, she let her composure slip, her legs giving out as she sank onto the edge of her bunk. Her mind buzzed, but her body felt numb as if it couldn't handle the weight of the revelation. Blake was alive and he had chosen to leave her, chosen a life where she no longer existed. Memories flooded her, hitting her in sharp, painful bursts. She remembered how she had clung to the few remnants of him after his supposed death. His worn-out leather jacket, the stack of postcards they'd collected from road trips, the list of dreams they'd planned to chase. Every piece had felt sacred, a testament to a love that had defined her. Now it all felt like an elaborate lie. She could still recall those endless, sleepless nights in the months after he was declared missing. She had spent hours combing through every memory, every conversation looking for a sign, something that might explain why he would do this. And yet, he'd left her with nothing but an empty life and a hollow pain that took years to quiet. Now he was telling her it was a calculated decision, a deliberate escape. Anger flared in her, fierce and consuming. How dare he decide what was best for her? How dare he decide that leaving her behind was somehow for her benefit? She could still feel the humiliation of having to reach out for help, of piecing her life back together alone, while he had reinvented himself in wealth and comfort. All those years she had believed herself widowed, while he was out there, living a new life under a new name. Her hands clenched as she fought to steady her breathing, her mind replaying his cold dismissal, the way he'd shrugged off the life they'd once shared as if it were an inconvenience he had long forgotten. It was as though she had never existed for him. A knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She quickly wiped her face, forcing herself to look composed. It was Elena, her concerned face peeking through the door as she entered quietly. "Hey," Elena murmured, closing the door behind her. "I thought I'd check in on you. Are you okay?" Madison managed a weak nod, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was, but I don't know anymore." Elena placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. "Whatever you decide to do, you're not alone in this," she said gently. "I'm here." A small wave of gratitude surged in Madison's chest. For the first time that night, she felt a spark of resolve, a reminder that she was not the broken woman Blake had left behind. She wasn't powerless. She'd built a life once, she could find strength again. The next morning, Madison woke with a raw determination simmering beneath the hurt. She sat at the small table in her cabin, her mind racing over the events of the past night. She had been given a second chance, not in her relationship with Blake, but in confronting the truth and reclaiming her sense of self. She could no longer live with unanswered questions and unresolved pain. She needed to understand what had driven him to abandon their life, to fake his death, and start over so coldly. Madison knew she had two choices. She could either expose him publicly, reporting him to the ship's security and potentially stirring up a scandal, or she could seek a more personal, private confrontation. The idea of reporting him was tempting. After all, hadn't he deserved to be held accountable after putting her through years of torment and loss? Yet, the thought of creating a public scene filled her with unease. She wasn't here to seek revenge or ruin him, she wanted closure. Taking a deep breath, she settled on a third option. She would confront him one last time, but this time she would let him know she was ready to walk away from him, no longer burdened by his choices. Whatever answers he chose to offer, she would accept them, close this chapter of her life, and find peace on her own terms. Resolute, Madison looked at her reflection in the small cabin mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There was a fierceness in her eyes she hadn't seen in years. "You deserve answers," she whispered to herself, grounding herself in the reality of her pain, her anger, and her right to know the truth. The thought brought a sense of calm and focus that she hadn't felt since first spotting him on the deck. She wasn't going to let him dictate how her story ended. This time she was in control. Madison stood, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face Blake once more. She would get her answers whether he wanted to give them or not. Madison found Blake that afternoon in one of the ship's exclusive lounges, a drink in his hand, talking animatedly with a few of his wealthy companions. As she entered, his smile faded, his posture stiffening as he caught her gaze. She walked toward him, ignoring the questioning looks from his friends. He excused himself reluctantly, clearly hoping to avoid another confrontation, but Madison had no intention of letting him walk away this time. Once they were alone in a quiet corner, she took a steadying breath, looking him in the eye with a calm intensity. "You thought you could just walk away, start a new life, and leave me in pieces," she began, her voice steady and unyielding. "But I refuse to be another ghost from your past, Blake, or should I say Daniel?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "I've spent 7 years grieving a lie, wondering why you never came back, why you didn't care enough to at least give me closure. You left me to rebuild everything alone, thinking I'd lost the one person who promised to stand by me." Blake shifted uncomfortably, but Madison's voice grew stronger. "So here's what's going to happen. I won't scream, I won't make a scene, and I won't ruin your precious reputation, though you deserve it. Instead, I'm reporting you to the authorities, sharing everything I know. I have proof of who you were before you became Daniel Blackwood, and believe me, there's a lot for them to uncover." A flicker of fear crossed his face, breaking through his practiced indifference. "Madison, please," he started, his voice now tinged with desperation. "No, Blake," she cut him off coldly. "You don't get to plead with me. You forfeited that right the day you left me to suffer alone. Whatever happens next is on you." With that, she turned to leave, feeling the weight of 7 years lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt whole, as if the power he had stolen from her had finally been reclaimed. She walked out of the lounge with her head held high, leaving Blake to confront the consequences of the life he had chosen to abandon. As she moved through the ship's corridors, Madison felt a quiet, resilient strength bloom within her. She hadn't simply survived his betrayal, she had conquered it. And with that, she walked away free at last. As the cruise ship continued its journey across the open ocean, Madison stood at the railing, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She let the warmth of the fading light fill her, each breath steady and unburdened. For years, she had carried a weight she couldn't explain, a feeling that something was unresolved, like a half-finished chapter lingering in her heart. But now that chapter was closed. News of her encounter with Blake, or Daniel, spread quietly among the crew. She didn't need to be the one to unravel his life. His secrets were already on a fast track to surfacing. His associates would have questions, the authorities would begin their investigations, and he would have to confront the reality he had tried so hard to escape. Madison knew she had made the right choice in walking away, choosing justice over revenge. Blake's downfall would be his own doing, not hers. For Madison, the future felt clearer than it ever had. She had spent too long tethered to the idea of a love that hadn't been real, trapped in memories that had lost their warmth. Now, standing on the ship's deck, she felt a sense of peace, a true release. Her life was her own again, unshackled from the grief and bitterness she'd carried alone for too long. Elena joined her at the railing, handing her a cup of coffee with a knowing smile. "To new beginnings?" she asked, raising her own cup. Madison returned the smile, feeling the corners of her mouth lift effortlessly. "To new beginnings," she echoed, the words both a promise and a release. She didn't know where the future would lead, but for the first time she was excited to find out. As the ship moved forward into the night, Madison allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. She wasn't the same person who had boarded the cruise, weighed down by unresolved heartache. She had faced her past, stood up to the person who had wronged her, and in doing so had rediscovered her strength. The open sea stretched before her, endless and full of possibility, and Madison knew that wherever her path led next, she would face it with resilience and courage. She had reclaimed her life, and there was nothing holding her back now. With a final look at the horizon, Madison turned from the railing, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartwarming tales with surprising twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you thought about the story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next one.